Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eileen Strumpel. It is my pleasure and honor to serve as the inaugural dean here at the Herb Alpert School of Music. And I am honored and delighted to welcome you to this continuation of this important conversation, Still Waiting. As many of you know, this series was designed and created by the Anti-Racism Action Committee of the school under the direction and leadership of our Associate Dean, Arturo O'Farrell, and for all of their collective efforts, I'm eternally grateful. At the heart of these conversations is reimagining in our hearts and our minds, reimagining our disciplines, our schools, and our societies. We had our inaugural speaker, Cornell West, who certainly lit up the stage here. But this afternoon, I'm very pleased to be welcoming a disruptor in her own right, Danielle Brown. Danielle is a woman of uncommon courage, uncommon conviction. She has the courage not only to question her discipline, to not only question the academy, to not only write public letters to to SEM, but she also has a moral compass that has led her to decide to leave the academy, to make uncommon decisions of great personal bravery. And it is this combination of courage combined with conviction that make me so honored and humbled and to welcome her to the virtual stage this evening. I'd like to thank Arturo O'Farrell, our Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I'd also like to thank both Luis and Jose for all of their welcome and all of their work in making all of this event possible. And now it is my pleasure to introduce a wonderful colleague and friend of mine, Cheryl Keys. She serves as chair of the African American Studies Department in the college, and she's also an esteemed professor right here in the School of Music, and she has the honor of introducing Danielle to you. Thank you for joining us. Please continue to engage in the conversation with us. And Danielle, on behalf of the School of Music, we welcome you with open arms and thank you for making the time to join us today. Dr. Keys.
Thank you very much, Dean Strumpel. I would like to share a few things about Dr. Danielle Brown. She is a multidisciplinary artist, scholar, and entrepreneur. She is the founder and CEO of My People Tell Stories, LLC, a company based on the premise that people of color in particular, and marginalized people in general, need to tell and interpret their own stories. My People Tell Stories provides education and consulting services to educators, businesses, and others seeking to dismantle the effects of systemic racism. Dr. Brown earned a doctorate in music from New York University with a concentration in ethnomusicology and specialization in the music of Latin America and the Caribbean. She is a former assistant professor of music, history, and cultures at Syracuse University and is certified in the Kadai method. Dr. Brown is the author of the music-centered ethnographic memoir, East of Flatbush, North of Love, an ethnography of home, and the East of Flatbush, North of Love teacher guidebook. She is a 2018 NYSCA NYFA Fellow in Folk Traditional Arts and was a visiting scholar in the Department of Musicology at the University of Miami during the academic year of 2019-2020. At this time, she is a visiting professor at Stanford University. And I also would like to just share a few things about what Dr. Brown will be speaking about with the title, The Elephant in the Room, BIPOC Artistic and Intellectual Presence in Music Studies. The topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the field of music has garnered considerable interest over the past several years. In particular, scholars and educators have been re-examining why past efforts to develop a diverse, equitable, and inclusive field have missed the mark. In this presentation, Dr. Brown talks about her efforts to address these issues and to create positive change through her work at My People Tell Stories and her social justice-minded framework, Canon, People, and Pedagogies, better known as CPP, specifically focusing on the people portion of her framework. Dr. Brown will discuss how addressing the elephant in the room, the minimization, the marginalization, and the devaluation of BIPOC artists and intellectuals requires more than diversifying the canon and increasing diversity hires. Rather, it requires a reckoning with the forces that ask BIPOC artists and intellectuals to be present even while denying their presence. So, without further ado, I would like to warmly welcome, Dr. Danielle Brown.
There's a sweet, sweet spirit in this place, and I know it is the Spirit of the Lord. There are sweet expressions on each face, and I know they feel the presence of the Lord. Sweet Holy Spirit, sweet heavenly dove, stay right here with us, filling us with your love. And for these blessings, we lift our hearts in praise. Without a doubt, we know that we have been revived when we shall leave this place. Good afternoon, everyone. It's evening time for me. And I have to now reshuffle my papers, which fell while I was singing. But it is wonderful to be in the presence of all of you, albeit virtually. And I want to say, I hope and pray that everyone is doing well. I hope that everyone has been able to find something to be grateful for, despite the hardships of the past year that I know have deeply, deeply impacted many, if not all of us. And so I want to take the time now to thank Arturo O'Farrell and the Herb Alpert School of Music for inviting me to speak with you all. I'd also like to thank Dr. Cheryl Keys in the Department of African American Studies for co-sponsoring this presentation, as well as Dean Eileen Strumpel, who I know from my days at Syracuse University. And I just want to thank you for such a warm welcome. And I also want to thank Susan Holcomb, Luis Henao, Jose Carrillo, and just everyone who was a part of making this happen and making me feel so welcomed here. I almost always start off my presentations with a song. And I like to joke that I do that because it helps me to get rid of my jitters. And that's true, right? I figure if I can sing in front of you, then I can talk in front of you. But you know, there's a certain amount of vulnerability that's needed when having certain types of discussions, and especially those that are centered around race and social justice. And so beginning with the song is a way to open up the space, and by extension, open us up, expose us, and allow us to be vulnerable enough to speak our minds while still being receptive to new ideas. It's also a way to invite in positive energies. So as the song says, I hope that without a doubt, we would have been revived and positively changed when we leave this session. So I'd like to start off with a brief slideshow and reading from the preface of my book, East of Flatbush, North of Love, an Ethnography of Home. Afterwards, I'll proceed with some words on diversity, equity, inclusion, and then the topic of BIPOC artistic and intellectual presence in music studies. In 2014, after having spent the better part of 12 years in academia, I quietly resigned my position as an assistant professor of music history and cultures at Syracuse University. I had been living in Syracuse for 2 years, and the city did not seem conducive to the psychological well-being of a young Black woman with no familial ties to the place. My dissatisfaction with the city was perhaps only surpassed by my dissatisfaction with my academic field, ethnomusicology in particular, and to a certain extent, academia as a whole. The musicological canon was still overly Eurocentric, even in my field where non-Western people historically have been overrepresented as subjects and objects of study. And perhaps worse, these subjects have been overwhelmingly researched and represented by researchers from outside of their culture. As a minority researcher, I saw little that validated my forms of knowledge, my experiences, my ways of being. I had become disillusioned with the system, and I could feel fatigue setting in. Academia had become a game that I no longer wanted to play, at least not under the current terms. It was time for me to go. And so I moved to New Orleans and started a small publishing and production company called My People Tell Stories, LLC. After all, my most significant education had come through the stories I had learned growing up. And I noticed that in my classes, students most connected with material that had a personal component to it, one that allowed them to think about the world of another and simultaneously reflect on their own. Consequently, for the company's first publication, I set out to write a retelling of my dissertation research on Parang music in Trinidad. However, the book had other ideas. Follow the Yellow Brick Road was my mother's suggestion to me when I told her that the book kept morphing. I heeded her advice and decided to see where this literary journey would take me. Then, on a rather unassuming day, while visiting home and running errands with my mom in Brooklyn, I thought to myself, ethnographic memoir, that's the type of story I'm writing. However, this was not the kind of ethnographic memoir that involved non-native researchers writing reflexive pieces about their fieldwork in a culturally foreign land. As stated in the book's title, this was an ethnography of home, a story written from a place of familiarity about places that were crucial to my development during my formative years. As I began doing some research on ethnographic memoirs, I came across a scholar by the name of Swami Anand Prahlad, who wrote an article in the Journal of American Folklore about his pending project, Getting Happy, an ethnographic memoir. Much of what Prahlad states in his article resonated with me. His decision to write an ethnographic memoir was, quote, driven by personal crises arising from the schizophrenia so common among first-generation and minority academicians. Continuing the quote, as many have noted, this fragmentation of self results from spending so many waking hours in an environment hostile to one's most authentic being, an environment in which the Eurocentric, imperialist mind stands guard over the bees of the hive with a cruel intensity equal to that of plantation overseers. In this case, though, control is enforced through polite, intellectual means rather than through the physical, a kind of control in which the class, race, and personal aesthetics and sensibilities of the institution clash so profoundly with one's own that a resulting psychological quandary is inevitable. This project reflects an effort to recover the parts of myself scattered about like bloody bodies on a field of war after a battle, to nourish them back to health and to reintegrate them into a whole based not on imperatives handed down by societal institutions, but on that disclaimed shadow that haunts the halls of Western power, the inner spiritual voice, end quote. In relatively few words, Paulette aptly captures the reasons for my departure from academia and my decision to write an ethnographic memoir. To say that writing this book served as a sort of therapy for me would be an understatement. Yet it was not the kind of project that allowed me to effortlessly abandon the norms of the discipline in which I had been enmeshed for several years. I fought myself the entire way. I was and still am fighting an ideology of colonialism and imperialism that is so entrenched in our culture and really across the globe that it is not easily discarded. At times, one has to be hyper-vigilant to detect its presence. Through this project, I was trying to retrieve myself from years of Western education that threatened to promote cultural amnesia. I was trying to decolonize myself before there was nothing left to colonize. There was an urgency to complete this project that was rooted in a certain terror that one feels when one's very existence is threatened. I had to prove to myself that I exist, and not because someone else had given me permission to exist. East of Flatbush, North of Love is a labor of love, an ode to my family and to my culture. My story is neither highly theoretical nor groundbreaking. It is a simple story of growing up in the West Indian enclave of East Flatbush, Brooklyn. This is not to say that there isn't a serious element that runs throughout. For all its simplicity, it is nonetheless a form of protest. By rejecting conventional ways of writing, I seek to reject conventional ways of thinking. The book calls into question how knowledge is produced and whose knowledge is privileged. Most importantly, it is a way to acknowledge that my people's stories are just as valid as the stories that others tell about us. This is a project about reclaiming power, dignity, and humanity. I wrote this book not only for myself, but also for young people and adults like me who want to see their reflections in the pages that they read and who are looking to learn a bit more about themselves and their heritage. I also wrote this book for people who know very little about West Indian culture, and as a result, my teacher persona has guided much of this writing. I have done my best to deliver a story that I hope will foster critical thinking and not merely the absorption of information. And I hope too that my experiences will be used as a safe avenue to talk about topics that make many of us feel uncomfortable, such as colonialism, racism, colorism, etc. I share my story because I wholeheartedly believe that unless we exchange our own personal stories, we cannot see where our personal understandings are perhaps short-sighted, unevolved, too localized, or just plain wrong. As I was writing this book, the deeply rooted racial anxieties and mistrust that had been long simmering just beneath the surface of the American consciousness seemed to have boiled over. And so fostering cross-cultural understanding took on a new urgency. This one book is not meant to transform the world. However, through it, I am taking responsibility for myself and doing what my spirit tells me needs to be done. I don't expect to topple the whole system of injustices with this book, but I will remove my support beam, or at least a portion of it. Signed, Danielle Brown, New Orleans, Louisiana, Thursday, August 13, 2015. Many, many, many years it took us to find the natural look. Many, many, many years it took. Now we have found the natural look. Suddenly out of the blue, this thing has struck like something new. Everybody young and old growing afro and telling the world, singing, Black is beautiful, Black is beautiful. Lift your head like me, you got to wear me color with dignity. Black is beautiful. Yeah, I'm Black and proud. It's high time that we get rid of this old slave mentality. I think it is safe to say that my name was relatively unknown in the larger field of music studies until I published my open letter on racism in music studies, especially ethnomusicology and music education. The initial impetus to write an open letter first came in 2017, long before the current moment where anti-racism and Black Lives Matter has been recognized widely in the mainstream. It was before the 2019 SCM conference debacle, where an opportunity to celebrate Blackness and Black scholars was not just overlooked, but ignored. It was before the world knew of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Everyday occurrences where Black people were present, but their presence, that is their humanity, was not felt. I say all this to say that the impetus to write the letter, that is the problem, existed even in the absence of large-scale movements, academic scandals, and public executions. Yet it is not lost on me that the delay in publishing the letter is what perhaps led to the enormous amount of attention it has garnished. As some have said, the timing was right. Over the past several months, I have watched as people have read and reacted to the letter in ways that have been largely predictable. There has been an increase in talks, lectures, presentations, panels, roundtables, et cetera, on anti-racism and DEI initiatives, DEI meaning diversity, equity, and inclusion. BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color scholars, and especially Black scholars, are increasingly in demand for their expertise. To some, this may seem like a good thing, and maybe it is, but fixing the system that I talk about in my letter will require much more than optics. People seem to understand that much, but I'm not sure people understand or are prepared for exactly what that will take and what that will look like. So when I was invited to speak as part of the Still Waiting series, I knew that I wanted to do a special presentation for this event. That is, I didn't want to just regurgitate one of my already established presentations, but I wasn't exactly sure what I would say. A lot of times ideas come to me in the middle of the night when I'm between sleep and wake. And at other times, ideas come just as my ideas are adjusting to a new day. Quite often, as you can imagine, I'm too lazy to get up and write them down, which means they sometimes fade from memory before they are firmly established in my mind. Fortunately, the idea for this presentation was strong enough that I knew it did not need to be written down. I would not forget. I woke up in the middle of the night with my former music teachers on my mind. In particular, those who were most influential in my musical development. And I knew that I wanted to focus on people. People is already a component of the Canon People and Pedagogies, or CPP framework, that I developed specifically to assist music educators, including researchers like ethnomusicologists, in achieving their goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the classroom and field at large. Briefly, the framework argues that regardless of intentions, DEI initiatives are bound to fail when diversity, equity, and inclusion are not understood to be a package deal. So what do I mean? Often when people are talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, they're mostly talking about creating and fostering diversity. So what is diversity? And those of you who know me know that I love dictionary definitions, just simple dictionary definitions. So Merriam-Webster defines diversity as the condition of having or being composed of differing elements, variety especially, the inclusion of different types of people, such as people of different races or cultures in a group or organization, example, programs intended to promote diversity in schools. 2, an instance of being composed of differing elements or qualities, an instance of being diverse, example, a diversity of opinion. Using Merriam-Webster's definition of diversity, referring to the inclusion of different types of people, we can say, with respect to race, for example, when people say they want more diversity, it means they want to increase the representation of people of color by the numbers. That is, we will increase the number of students of color in the classroom or people of color on the job. With respect to music studies, people may talk about creating a more diverse repertoire, one that includes more music from the so-called non-Western world and that is less centered on Western art music. So if diversity refers to inclusion of different types of people, to what does inclusion refer? Inclusion refers to creating an environment of belonging by valuing the contribution and participation of all. Dr. Geraldine Cochran, a physicist who also works on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion as it pertains to STEM, makes a clear distinction between being included, that is diversity, versus inclusive environments or inclusion. So now you guys are going to taste of my little dinner example. So for example, you want to welcome a growing number of vegans in your neighborhood by throwing a dinner party, right? You have created a seat at the proverbial table for the non-meat eating members of your community. Now at the dinner party, you serve an all-meat menu. So while you have created an event that includes your vegan neighbors, you have not created an inclusive environment. So I really want you now to kind of just put yourself in the position of your vegan neighbors, or if you're a diehard carnivore and you just can't sympathize, just imagine you went to a dinner party that had no meat, no chicken, no fish, just like lettuce and alfalfa sprouts. How would you feel? What do you expect your vegan neighbors to do? Do you expect them to feel comfortable? They didn't eat beforehand because they were expecting a good meal. Now they're hangry and irritable. And if you know that Betty White Snickers commercial, you'll understand what I mean. They're hangry, they're irritable, and you've put them in a position where it's challenging to present their best self or even function. So I want you to think, how many of you would stay at the dinner party? How many of you would leave? How many of you would accept another invitation? Inclusive environments allow those who are marginalized to not just be physically present, but to thrive and feel like they belong and are welcomed and valued in a space. A similar example in education might look precisely like my experience at the start of graduate school. It was only when I embarked on my graduate school journey that I realized how systemic the lack of diversity, equity, inclusion in the field of music actually was. I remember going into the department at NYU to take my music theory entrance exam. 2 weeks prior, my mentor, and the reason I had entered the field, had died at the ripe old age of 37. Already upset at her passing, I sat down to take the test and was presented with an exam that only tested knowledge on Western art, music, and theory. There was a chord analysis of a Bach chorale, a piano reduction of a Stravinsky orchestral piece, and another item or two that I can't remember. I got up and left. I could have taken the exam, and I eventually did without a problem. I was trained in Western art, music, and theory, having studied music from ancient Greece and Rome through the 20th century, including music of the Baroque, Classic, and Romantic periods, among others. The exam reflected what I had studied as an undergraduate at Trinity College. However, I had also trained heavily in jazz, piano, and theory. Where was that on the exam? Besides, I had no intention of studying Western art music at the graduate level. So why was I being required to take an entrance exam that had little bearing on my future work, but could potentially prevent me from continuing my studies and receiving the doctorate? Now, at the end of the day, I was prepared to take that exam. But what about the many musicians I know, far more talented than myself, who would not be able to pass such an exam simply because their musical expertise was in another area? So imagine a student arrives to take an entrance exam that has nothing to do with her interest and does not aptly measure her skills. Not feeling welcomed by a department that clearly knows her musical background, she eventually drops out of a program. Just like the vegans in the previous example, bringing people to the table is not enough. You have to be willing to create an environment that makes people feel welcome. You have to feed them what is necessary for their growth. My cohort would be the last to take that theory entrance exam. The department had decided to no longer require a theory exam as part of its entrance requirements. I probably would have created a new exam as opposed to removing it altogether, but ultimately that was the decision of the department. So now the story of the entrance exam is not only an example of lack of inclusivity, but equity as well. Equity guarantees fair treatment, equality of opportunity, and fairness in access to information and resources. With respect to equity, Dr. Cochran states that, quote, equity concerns focus more on changing structures and systems that create the inequities in the first place, end quote. So if we translate this to music education, we would, for example, examine the barriers to admission into music programs. That is, are there built-in barriers that lead to lower numbers of BIPOC music educators? What are they? The lack of inclusivity in programs, as described in the previous example, would be one. If opportunities to become music educators primarily exist for those trained in Western art music, then that is a barrier that prevents musicians with training and expertise in other musical traditions from entering the field. That translates into less access to quality jobs that can lead to generational wealth. And I just want to make a quick distinction between equity and equality, because although the two words are related, they're not the same. While equality refers to providing people with the same tools, equity refers to providing people with the tools necessary for their success, with an understanding that everyone will not need the same resources. And I think this picture, which you may or may not have seen, there are many variations, but I think they aptly express the difference in meaning between the two words. So on the left-hand side with equality, you see there are three people who are trying to look at a football or a soccer match, and they each have a crate that they're standing, well, one's not standing. They each have a crate that's designed to give them a boost so that they can watch the match. On the left, you can see the man in the red shirt did not need a crate. He was tall enough to watch without. The young girl, she needed two in order to really be able to see comfortably. And the person in the wheelchair, the crate served no purpose. Person in the wheelchair, a ramp was best suited to that person. And so connecting this again to music, equality is giving everyone the same entrance exam. Equity is recognizing that you may need to create different exams to adequately assess students studying different areas of music. The School of Ma. I was enrolled in the School of Ma at birth, and it's doubtful that I will ever graduate. It's not that I'm a dull student, it's just that there's always more to learn. My schooling at Emma Lazarus was often supplemented with my mother's teachings. One of my earliest memories consisted of my mom's suggestion that I make civil rights activist and Trinidadian native Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, the subject of my Black History Month book report. While some of Mom's lessons came in the form of direct conversations, many of them were made poignant through song. You don't know that one? My mother would ask before erupting in verse. Well, the girls in town feeling bad. No more Yankees in Trinidad. They had to close down the base for good. Them girls had to make out how they could. Brothers, now they're back up in town. In for a penny and in for a pound. Believe me, it's competition for so. Trouble in the town when the price drop low. So when you bounce up Jean and Dinah, Rosita and Clementina, round the corner posing, bet your life is something they're selling. And if you catch them broken, you can get them all for nothing. Don't make a row. The Yankees gone and Sparrow take over now. My mother introduced me to the US presence in Trinidad during World War II by singing Jean and Dinah, a well-known calypso by Slinger Francisco, more popularly known as the Mighty Sparrow. She would later explain that as part of the Lend-Lease Act with Great Britain, the US was permitted to lease land in Trinidad for a period of 99 years until the early termination of that agreement by Dr. Eric Williams. In my mother's words, Dr. Williams told Americans to get the hell out. Jean and Dinah is not only about prostitution, but also some of the ways that colonialism and imperialism have contributed to the destabilization of Trinidad society. Mom used the song as a teaching tool. So I reiterate that diversity, equity, inclusion are a package deal. All three are mandatory. The CPP framework is designed to look at all three of those issues, diversity, equity, inclusion, by examining the canon, people, and pedagogies. And in the same way that diversity, equity, inclusion is a package deal, so is the canon, people, and pedagogies framework. And so I'm just going to briefly go through this. So briefly speaking, the canon consists of the repertoire, instruments, and resources that have become most ubiquitous with music education in the United States. And so the pictures on this slide represent what the canon has looked like historically with respect to music education in this country. So at the top, we have our good old friend Mozart, and he's just representative of the composers, arrangers, performers that are commonly taught in our current system. Then you have instruments, the keyboard, and then we have resources looking at the score. But the canon does not have to look like this, right? It could just as easily look like this. And so at the top, brownie points for anyone who knows that, that's Daisy Voisin from Trinidad. She's was a parang singer or paranda singer, and really one of the people who was most influential in women and young girls coming out to sing parang, which was once very much male dominated. And then we have instruments, is a little bit, cliche, but I do have drums here. And then resources, oral materials as opposed to written sources, right? So diversifying the canon exposes students to people, places, and things that are different from what they know. It's an important step in expanding their consciousness about the world around them and eradicating this dangerous notion that music is a universal language. However, it is not the only step. The second fundamental, people, refers to those who are teaching music in our schools, and they should not be confused with the people who are part of the canon. So I'm not talking about here the composers, arrangers, performers. And so when we're talking about the fundamental people, some of the questions we might ask are, who are the teachers in our schools? Do they reflect the diversity of our students, nation, and world? And we know that in the United States, music educators are still overwhelmingly white, this despite the population of students rapidly changing to BIPOC. And so these are some of the things that we would look at with respect to people. Pedagogies, which is the last fundamental, refers to the frameworks and strategies used to teach content. And so pedagogies reflect how we teach, not what we teach, and reveal the basic premises from which we are working. So usually, if I'm giving a 90-minute presentation on the CPP framework, while I talk about the people fundamental, it does not receive as much attention as the other two, Canon and Pedagogies, which I discuss more thoroughly. With respect to the people fundamental, I usually state why and how the lack of diversity, in particular racial diversity among music teachers at the pre-collegiate and collegiate levels is problematic. I discussed the importance of representation of BIPOC scholars and educators for students, that studies have shown that outcomes for students of color improve when they have even one same race teacher before the age of 18, and vastly improve if students have at least 2 same race teachers. I also discussed how the lack of BIPOC teachers also represents a lack of equity for those BIPOC individuals who would like to enter the field of music education and whose culture and musical expertise are not valued by the current system. I state that addressing equity issues surrounding people would increase education and economic outcomes for BIPOC students and also increase economic outcomes for would-be teachers. To put a cherry on top, I state that increasing BIPOC teachers in music would alleviate some of the anxiety of white teachers now face when tasked with teaching all the world's cultures as we try to diversify the curriculum. During Q&A, we sometimes get into the specifics of how and why some DEI initiatives fail. I don't doubt that these conversations are useful. If I did, then I wouldn't have them. People seem to appreciate them and genuinely find them helpful. However, for me, there remains a knowing that comes from a knowing that this does not go deep enough. We can make great strides to minimize structural racism by implementing certain changes with respect to the canon and incorporating various pedagogical strategies. We can even increase the numbers of BIPOC scholars and educators and create working environments that for all intents and purposes are inclusive. So why am I still not at ease? This goes to the heart of the title of this presentation, The Elephant in the Room, BIPOC Artistic and Intellectual Presence in Music Studies. As I mentioned earlier, you can be present, but your presence not felt. First, I guess I should give some sort of understanding of what I mean by the word presence. After all, doesn't presence refer to the act of being present, as the following definitions would suggest? Here I go again with my definitions. And so I just took a few of these from Merriam-Webster online. There were a couple that just for space purposes, I didn't include and they didn't really add to the conversation, but a noun. So we have one definition, the fact or condition of being present, right? Then the next one that is present, such as A, the actual person or thing that is present, or B, something present of a visible or concrete nature. Another definition says the bearing, carriage, or air of a person, especially stately or distinguished bearing. A noteworthy quality of poise and effectiveness. Example, the actor's commanding presence. And then finally, we have something such as a spirit felt or believed to be present. Perhaps this last definition, something such as a spirit felt or believed to be present, best captures how I am attempting to use the word. It is that a spirit, an essence, that intangible thing that gives validity to our existence in a human form. It is not just the form, not just the vessel, but the thing within the vessel and how that thing shows up in the world. I say the presence of BIPOC artists and intellectuals is the elephant in the room, not just because many of our white colleagues and peers don't want to talk about the dismal numbers of us represented in our schools, colleges, and universities, that is the number of us present, but also because when we do talk about it, we miss the mark. We talk about numbers, we talk about cultural differences, but rarely do we talk about worldview and how differences in worldview really affect BIPOC artists and scholars' presence in music studies. I'll try to make this a more tangible and I guess applicable to music with a bit of a compare and contrast with Western art music and music of the African diaspora, generally speaking. So Western art music focuses very much on form, musical form, whether that is sonata form, blues form, etc. There's privilege given to form. And while form and theory are a part of African-based music, despite a Eurocentric notion that they are not, or that they're at best inferior, the importance lies not on the form, but what is within the form, and that is life itself. A whole system for living is encoded in Black music. Black music, African music, is about living. It teaches you about life. It teaches you how to come into this world and how to leave. It teaches you how to make love and how to make war. In essence, it teaches you about what you will confront in the world and how to proceed with navigating life in this world. Compared to how we treat Western art music, this is very different. This is a very different way of being in the world, of being present in the world. Western art music does not function in this way. And so Black music, its presence, cannot be felt by merely becoming an appendage to already in place systems. Because to teach Black music in all its gloriousness is to contend with the fact that we cannot teach it only through sound. No, to teach Black music, African-based music, you have to know the world and worldview in which it continues to live. This would mean not only knowing the sounds and some basic historical figures, but also the literature, food, religious practices, child-rearing practices, etc. Black music, African-based music is not just about sound. It is about communicating all that life encompasses. And then I'm reminded that it is precisely this penchant for communication that makes our music so dangerous. It is known that throughout the Americas, musical ordinances were put into effect, outlawing the musical practices of enslaved Africans and their descendants. Much of this pertained to drumming practices, which allowed Africans to communicate with God, as well as various types of spirits, including humans, both living and dead. Restrictions on music were designed not just to stop rebellions, but to strip Africans and the descendants of part of their life force, part of their humanity, that part that said they were worthy of rebellion. Again, our music encompasses all of life, and as such is coded with spirituality, with warrior's blood, with humanity. So much so that to teach it as such would be to rebel, would be to start to break down the structures that deny us and others our very humanity. Our music at its foundation is a multi-layered art that represents the elements of life in all forms. And so when I see attempts to diversify curricular or even pedagogical strategies without the presence of BIPOC educators, I see it as an attempt to pacify a necessary revolution. When I see our musical contributions relegated to electives and after-school programs rather than core material, I see it as an attempt to pacify a necessary revolution. When I see attempts to make us present by placing colonized and empty Black and brown vessels in positions of power, I see it as an attempt to pacify a necessary revolution, and even an attempt to pacify a necessary evolution in humans. A friend of mine once told me, your book is a misa, or a mass for your ancestors. I had never thought about it that way, but in many ways it was. The book was a way of me connecting with my lineage through music, and in many ways, a sort of homage to those who came before, a way of sending them a little light. It was a way of me trying to grapple with the role of music in my life and how that clashed with what the Academy tried to tell me was important. Years of gaslighting at the hands of various institutions and the people running them have led many of us BIPOC artists and intellectuals to gaslight ourselves and doubt what we know. How do we show up as BIPOC artists or intellectuals in academia? How is our presence felt when our worldview is understood on a theoretical level, but not on a visceral level? How do we show up as teachers, professors, researchers, artists? This is the elephant in the room, one that we have to reckon with, lest in all our attempts to create diversity, equity, inclusion in music studies, we miss the mark one more time. I hope you don't misunderstand me none. I'm not comparing us with anyone. I'm only saying colored that we are, should never selves I feel inferior. The Lord above who made the night and day has given both their equal parts to play. Now if you are on our side, open your mouth and shout it with pride. Black is beautiful. Black is beautiful. Lift your head like me. You got to wear my color with dignity. Black is beautiful. Sound black and proud. You'll completely beat this feeling of inferiority. You'll completely beat this feeling of inferiority. You'll completely beat this feeling of inferiority. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes. I want to thank you for such a powerful and impactful presentation that continues to question aspects of inclusion, the canon, the pedagogy, of course, and the people. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was just powerful. And I also want to use this as an opportunity to invite others who may have questions, and please submit them and put them in that Q&A or chat, and I'm sure I'll be able to see them. But I have to say that as I was listening to your journey from Flatbush, Brooklyn, New York, all the way down to New Orleans, it's amazing because we kind of traveled in very similar ways. Where I went up as I was doing my research, on hip hop in what is often considered the Mecca, New York City. And then, of course, I'm from Louisiana. So the first thing I wish to ask you is what was, or did it inspire, and how, and what was it in New Orleans that inspired your beginning to redirect your journey as a music educator and as one who needed to tell the stories of her people?
Yeah, so we kind of flipped, I guess.
Yeah, indeed.
I always say, so in 2012, SEM held a joint session with the American Musicological Society and Society for Music Theory that was in New Orleans. And I attended that meeting, and that was my first time in New Orleans. And I always say, had I not gone to New Orleans, I might have still been at Syracuse. So New Orleans, there was a time, even before I was at Syracuse, when I was living in New York City, and I kept telling myself, oh my gosh, like I just need to get out of the city, but where do I go? New York is a hard place to leave because there are so many opportunities there. There is this richness of cultures of people from all over the world. And, I could just never figure out where to go, and so I just stayed in the city. And then when I attended that conference, that SEM conference in 2012, and I went to New Orleans, I kind of fell in love. And it's because it had, for me, this quality of the things that I kind of needed, which is one, a city that was interesting and lively, that had different cultures and good food, but it reminded me so much of the Caribbean, right? And so that history is there, and you can see it. I mean, even in the ways that people in New Orleans talk about making groceries, we say that in Trinidad, right? And just lanyap and all these different words and phrases and ways of communicating, and it had the friendliness of that at least I associated with the Caribbean of my youth, because I think the Caribbean has changed a lot over the years, but it had that friendliness that you don't find in New York. You know, I hate to say, but we, you know, there's a way of growing up in New York and being and kind to have to put this kind of front on to be a little bit tough. Not to say that people in New Orleans aren't tough. We know that that's not the case also, but there is a friendliness where you walk down the street and someone will say, you know, what's happening, or, you know, good morning, or just something to acknowledge, talk about presence, to acknowledge your presence, right? Whereas in New York, you say something to someone like that, and it, you know, there could be words for, you know, for fighting. You don't say, hey, what's up, to somebody that you don't know, because they're like, yeah, what's up? You know, what is up? Let me know. So I will say New Orleans had that, that mix, I guess, of what I was looking for. It reminded me of the Caribbean, but it was still city enough for me. And I love New Orleans to this day. I love New Orleans.
Well, you know, it's interesting, before I get to the more of the pedagogical canon question, as you've kind of opened the, or inspired me to think about song when talking about experience, as I must have to say, do you know what it means to miss New Orleans? And that's all I know, because I still miss New Orleans. You know, once you go there, you get bit by that bug.
Yeah.
And I've heard many of my colleagues who are from the Caribbean, or the Caribbean, as I often heard pronounced in that way, that, and I always tell them, do not leave the U.S. without, of course, visiting the South, and particularly New Orleans. But what I want to ask you too, just to do with more or less the musical aspect at which in which you've organized, I think it was 4 segments, or if I say 4 preludes. How do you select or go about, and what's the significance of the songs you use in what I kind of see as interludes? From the beginning, you had an interlude in the second, you had an interlude in the third, you have an interlude, and actually an outro.
Yes.
So I do remember the song, since with African or with Black people, a song has such a meaning and trigger memory. So obviously, the first that you began and you open up with, there's a sweet, sweet spirit in this place. I haven't played church in a long time, but I remember that. And that was always a very calming type of song, or spiritual in case, as we sort of take from the hymns and we repeat certain things that does something for us as Black people.
Yes.
So I'd like to know the meaning of the songs and how you select the songs as you integrate them in your presentation today.
Well, that opening song, you know, like I said, I do tend to open up with a song, but that song in particular is one of my favorites, just because I feel the words of it really lends itself to kind of positive energy and people kind of opening themselves up to spirit, right? Or to presence. Again, spirit is one of the things that, you know, it's always interesting when I try to do presentations, and especially as I'm just thinking through these things. Spirit is one of those things that's very difficult to talk about, but I feel is so integral to talking about Black music or African-based music, and especially in the academy. But that song to me lends itself to opening us up to be receptive to energies and to people's ideas, right? Really just kind of opening. It's a blessing. And so in all the songs that I start with are in many ways blessings. That's what they are, you know, and I don't know if that goes back to, you know, growing up in the church where, you know, you start church with a prayer, a song, you know, there's a way, and not just churches. I mean, I think we do that in everyday life, you know, just even thinking about, you know, going to assemblies and used to start with, you know, the Star Spangled Banner or whatever, you know, songs that we start with. We have this tendency to kind of open up. And so that's really the reason. And that song in particular is just one that is very special for me. It tends to be the one that I open up a lot of presentations with. The other songs, Black is Beautiful, and it's interesting because when I wrote this, there are so many variations of this. I've been thinking through this presentation for months now, and it ended up being something that I don't think I imagined it was going to be. And you know, I was talking about different there were distinct parts to the presentation. And so for me, as a way to kind of segue, a song can be useful. Black is Beautiful. I mean, we're in Black History Month, although I usually don't even really think about Black History Month, because for me, every month really is Black History Month. It's like when, I used to tell my mom, how come there's no Children's Day? And she used to say, well, every day is Children's Day. So, for me, Black History Month I'm always thinking about the history and the culture of Black people. So, but I think it's important, again, in terms of just thinking about the presence of Black people. Like we are present, but our beauty is not necessary. Our humanity is not received. And so I think for me, it felt necessary to sing that song. And that's one of the songs that my mom used to sing to us growing up. I always say my mom has like a song for every occasion, and so that was the one for me that I felt I really wanted to sing. I think it just works well as a song in terms of singing it a cappella also, but Black is Beautiful. And I think that's something we don't hear enough. And that's a song from, the 70s by the Mighty Duke, during what they call the Black Power period in Trinidad and Tobago. And I think it's worth reminding people of the beauty of Black people, because again, when we talk about the presence, it's like we're here, but are we really being seen and felt?
This is interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking melodically, I was thinking about certain songs that I recall. And one of them, when you just mentioned Black is Beautiful, obviously to all of us, we have to give props to Nina Simone's To Be Young, Gifted, and Black.
Mm-hmm.
And she was so inspired by Lorraine Hansberry. And as To Be Young, Gifted, and Black essentially became, as one would say, the anthem of SNCC, which goes back to your Trinidadian, then Stokely Carmichael, as we eventually, as he changed his name to Kwame Ture, so Ture and Kwame Ture. But when you were talking about when you were on the faculty at Syracuse University, I couldn't help but to think of the song, believe it or not, by Minnie Riperton, Back Down Memory Lane. And I want to see if we can stretch a little bit back down memory lane, that when you reflect on what actually made you leave the academy, what would have made you stay at Syracuse University when you go back and down memory lane? And in terms of being a Black woman and what it felt like and what you would recommend to make Black students, Black faculty, Black staff in music departments or schools of music or universities in general, what would make one feel comfortable, inclusive? What does it take? And what would have been life-altering for you? Not that this isn't, but to say if you were to remain at Syracuse University.
Well, I mean, it's hard to really say what would have made me stay, because to some extent I kind of, I'm like, well, it was moved for me to go, and so I went. But I do always have a tendency to say that, if Syracuse University was in New Orleans, so I do tend to say that. I think it was an overall feeling. I think Syracuse, for me, the university, Syracuse, the city itself, it has a kind of, I won't say depressing vibe, but a depressing vibe. And I know some people say, it's lack of sunlight, and some people get hit with sad up there. But I think it was really a combination of factors. And so I don't know if it was just the university. I think had things in the field been different, I might have decided to stay. Because I always say I was lucky. I know people who are in departments that were just horrific. I'd hear horror stories. I didn't have that situation where I was really feeling like, oh my God, I'm under attack or anything like that. But I also didn't feel that the field was progressive, right? I felt like there was a bit of complacency. And so for me, I needed something that was more progressive. And that's how I felt about the Academy just in general, especially when it comes to music studies. And again, I know people who had actually vastly, when I say vastly different, vastly in the sense of, I don't know how they stayed 2 days in that department kind of experiences. Mine wasn't like that, but it was enough for me to leave, because it's hard to imagine staying in a place where you don't feel you're making the kinds of, you're living your life the way that you need to, right? And so for me, if I'm seeing a problem in music studies, and it doesn't seem like it's going to change anytime soon, and it seems like the thing is, okay, wait till you get, you become an associate professor or a full professor, and then you can just start saying whatever you want, that was problematic for me. It was too much of a burden for me. And so, that was a personal decision. And I always said, though, that I was leaving the Academy, but if I ever returned, I would want it to be on my own terms, that not staying in a position just to stay there, but I would need to see the changes happening. So that was just something for me, just again, with the field at large being quite uncomfortable with it.
And you made comments about outlaw when you said there was one point,
right.
what was it, during the period, I want to say 1740s, I think after the Stonewall Rebellion, then of course the drum was outlawed. But there were other things that were outlawed, but Black people still made a way out of no way back during that time, but even from then to now. And we also were part of how we record our experiences. As you know, many of the memoirs, as they often call the slave narratives or slave memoirs, from Solomon Northup, also a musician, even Frederick Douglass. It was something about writing about the experience that did something to them. Now, I can't, it was never written down for me to, not even today, to ask them because they're not around. But when we continue to see live narratives that are of today, as a Black woman educator, what does it do for you? What do you experience as you write, as you use that powerful tool that cannot be outlawed, but it can be extremely potent and significant as it continues to move the barometer and perhaps decolonize for the people and educate and revolutionize the people and others who want to know about Black music, incorporated in the music curriculum, into the university setting, or as I should say, in the ivory tower. So when you said that you have, there are times at night when you think of something, it comes to you, and then sometimes you just don't get up and write it down. But eventually when you write it down, something happens. What is that type of experience of being able to write and to tell your people's stories? What does it do for you?
I think for me, honestly, it's funny because I used to say if I wasn't gonna be a musician, I'd be a writer. The two I think are both powerful mediums, and I feel kind of two ways which might seem contradictory about them. I think for me, writing is part of leaving a legacy, right? And it is part of remembering, again, when my friend said, this is a misa or a mass for your ancestors, I never thought of it that way. And to me, it was just like, oh, wait, but it really is. It's part of me connecting. But I also kind of feel, because I grew up, I grew up in a way where my mom was always passing things down to us orally. I also feel like that's very powerful too. And so for me, a lot of it is, I'm amazed when we talk about these living narratives. When I look at artists today and I look at the work that they're doing, and you can see that lineage going centuries back, right? Centuries back without anybody having written it down. To me, that is so powerful. And then when you see the connections between Africa, you see it between the Caribbean, you see it then in the US, and the ways that they're all so interconnected. To me, it's a lineage that was not able to be broken, despite the fact of having been told that we have no history, that it was left far back. It's still there, right? And even in young kids, right? They're singing the songs of their ancestors. And I mean, it's really there. It's not just like oh, it's an imagination. Like, these songs, these traditions are really there. And sometimes they're there and we don't even realize it. But writing it down for me is, I needed to get that out of my system. And I almost feel like it was more for the academy. Not only, I mean, again, part of it was also to be able to share these stories in a larger fashion with people who need to see themselves represented. Like I said, I wanted to see myself represented. And I don't even think I realized how much it mattered to others, despite that was part of my intention, until people came back and said, oh my gosh, that was, that you're talking about my childhood, that was me, and even this always moved me. I remember going to, I was in Tobago and I was doing a reading at the library there. And there was an older gentleman, he had to have been older than my parents. And he said to me, he was able to see his childhood in the book. And that for me really meant something, because here's a man who didn't grow up in the United States. He didn't even grow up in Trinidad. He grew up in Tobago, and I have family from Tobago, but both of my parents were born and raised in Trinidad. And so for me, for him to be able to have that recognition, right, is important. Because again, like I said, towards the end, we, Black and brown people, other people of color, we have a tendency to even gaslight ourselves, and sometimes to kind of doubt the importance of our lives. And so I think that recognition, to just that validation is important. And so I think in terms of writing this out, it's important. But I think in many ways, the writing is important also, because we live in a society where the written word on paper, right, has become so important for proving kind of who you are in your existence. So I have mixed feelings. I have mixed feelings about it.
Yeah, well, one thing I can say about the pen, it, to me, serves as another form, cathartic, of course, but also somewhat like the extension of your soul. The extension, right? Sometimes writing it allows you to experience a certain kind of spiritual level, similar to that of creating or composing music as an African American. That writing is powerful. It too was once outlawed, but it was some kind of way. We found a way out of no way to educate ourselves and to use sort of flipping the script on Audre Lorde, the master's tool, to break down the house of the master.
Yeah.
So that's that writing is absolutely on par, I feel, with oration. Absolutely very, very powerful. And even those of the composers, the Undine Smith Moores, the Black composers, the William Grant Stills, and even some of the contemporary composers, even jazz, all of the genres. Something about the music and something about writing. You have the text, you have the song, or the lyrics with the music. They come together. Look at hip hop. That's a very good way by which we see the power of the word, be it through the oral or the oral tradition, as in the case with hip hop, or an improvisation in general. But also, I just find that when I write and express myself about something that I'm discontent about or have issues with in terms of uh, exclusion and being treated unfairly.
Mhm.
Writing has been that very, very powerful way of expressing myself. So that's why I was asking you about
Yeah.
how you tell the stories of your people with the pen. It's very, very powerful.
And I think you hit it. It's the word, right? And it's like it's getting that, whether it's a vocal utterance or you're getting it on paper, but it's that word is an act of creation itself,
Right.
and
Mhm.
so yeah, it comes through that way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, we have a few questions from the audience. We have one from Miss Allen, and she posed the question: do you see the needle being moved in regards to academic institutions
Mhm.
establishing more diverse and inclusive music curriculum?
So this is always a question. I'm always just like, because I don't want to say I'm a skeptical person, but I am a little bit, right? And so
Uh,
I'm always trying to think ahead, in the sense that, okay, these changes are happening, but are these changes meant to appease, or are these changes for longevity purposes? And that's kind of, it might be like a twisted, sinister way of thinking, but I'm from New York, so that's how I'm thinking. Right now, I'm hopeful again, but from what I've been experiencing through my conversations with people, it seems like there's really a push to make things better. But I also know that, again, as they say, the road to hell was paved with good intentions. And so
mm,
I think we have to be really careful about how we proceed. And I only, I think only time will tell. And I say that because, things, I almost want to say the needle is always moving, right? We have generational differences. I remember giving a presentation on the book, and I remember a student asking me, your mom was so, she's so progressive, for a time. And I said, yeah. And I said, in some ways, I said, yeah, she's progressive. But I said, my mom was also the person who used to tell me, speak proper English. She spoke the Queen's English. She speak proper English. And I was very fresh and rude. And I used to say, there's no such thing as proper English. There's standard English, And I think, but for her generation, proving that you could speak the language of your oppressors, that was a way of making progress in the world and moving, right? Now, we hold on to that a little bit, but we've actually kind of moved a little bit away from that kind of thinking. And so who knows, 10, 20 years down the line, someone might look at what I'm doing and say, yeah, but she wasn't that progressive because she missed, you know what I'm saying?
mhm.
I think the needle always needs to move a little bit. I don't think, we definitely have not arrived. We definitely have not arrived. And I definitely think there's more to do, because again, I think we do have to think about these things more deeply. We've been talking about multicultural music and diversity in music education and all that for a long time, completely forgetting that it's not just about what the music itself, but how are you teaching that music, right? That's also important. And so, we're starting to now to get moving towards that. Okay, we'll start looking at the different kinds of pedagogical strategies and those kinds of things. But does that work if they're only white music teachers? Or research predominantly, doing this kind of work? No, we also have to look at people. And so I think I'm hoping that we'll get closer. But what I'm really hoping is that the changes that are put in place are not simply put there to kind of shut people up quickly and make them forget. And then in the meantime, underneath the surface, there are other changes, other things afoot that will kind of put us back. So I don't want us to take, 2 steps forward and then we actually take 3 steps, not even 1 step, 3 steps back, right? So I'm always conscious about that. So I think it's just we have to keep monitoring the situation and really thinking really deeply about these things, and yeah, how we can just make improvements in the field.
Or do you see a little bit happening? Anything that's different from going back down from when you talk about that past university? And as you've continued to sojourn or take on lectureship positions at like the University of Miami and at Stanford, are you beginning to see things that are really happening and are becoming more in institutionalizing Black music studies inclusively, I should say, in music curriculum, particularly at the undergraduate level?
I think we're definitely seeing those shifts. And I think we've definitely seen in terms of, entrance exams, like I said, my cohort was the last, and that was, I won't say how many years ago, but they were the last to do that. And I've seen those kinds of shifts, trying to, include more, include more, more courses related to, people, for example, of the African diaspora, music of the African diaspora, things of that sort. There is still, I think, I'm still wary, and I think it's somewhat it's a little bit difficult. I don't want to paint a broad brush over all institutions, because I think they function very differently at different institutions, depending. So there's some, I think, institutions that are really making strides, and I think there are others that are doing performative acts, and then I think there are others that are really, they're not even trying to perform, right? So I think it varies. I'm seeing things at different levels at different institutions. And I think that's probably the fairest thing to say without just kind of, painting a broad stroke. I think some schools are really making the kinds of changes that we need to see start happening. My main concern, I think, right now is that as we're making these changes, right, as we're changing up the canon, we're changing up the pedagogy and all those things, we still, I think, have a fundamental issue, and that is that the worldview of BIPOC individuals, and I mostly talk about people of the African diaspora, is not really, it's not understood, right? In the same ways that when we go into a class, for example, on Western art music, we've been living in this kind of quote unquote Western world. So even BIPOC individuals, we understand that world. We've been reading the literature like in school. We've been doing those things, but I really, it's the reverse doesn't happen. And this is even with people listening to hip hop, listening to jazz, listening to all, there's still not an understanding of this worldview. And I think that's why we're seeing, the problems that we have now just in society at large in terms of this racial unrest, is because we're living in the same place, but we're not understanding the world in the same way. And so that's, I think, going forward, as we make these structural changes, I think that's something to consider, because if not, there's the potential for us to kind of fall back.
And I also think, when to reach out to the students, I think it's very important that they too are proactive. I mean, to talk about the world today realistically, if you decide to go, either it could be public sector or even the academy, which most of us, when we graduate, we end up teaching somewhere. It's important to be able to relate to your students. And one of the musics that these students love, it comes right out of the Black community. So it is something upon, that our students should think seriously, not to graduate from a music school or a music department without having taken a class on Black music, because you're gonna, everybody, when you talk about, I don't need to talk about the bell hooks eating the other, everyone's trying to do the Black thing. Everybody's trying to do the melismas, trying to sound like they're out of the church. And you don't understand that until
Yeah.
you get in a classroom, you're forced to be in a classroom, you look around and you say, duh, what I'm going to do? Because I may be white, the rest of these students don't look like me. So it's very important, you know, for students to understand, to not live in a shell when it's only just Europe, but also world music, ethnomusicology, of course, but specifically Black music. Black music courses are extremely important, and I would just like to see them um, become not just an elective, but integrated
Right.
into the curriculum, because it is, as Billy Taylor has said, and as the facts show, it is the indigenous music of the US. It is built on those experiences, shaped by the experiences of Black people, Black enslaved people during the colonial period, all the way up to now. You know, the music dictates every moment, every change, every tide in the lives of Black people. So the music dictates that. It's amazing when you look at the wellspring of Black musical genres. I mean, there's from the 1600s all the way to the 21st century. That's a lot.
Yep.
So it's just on, in my opinion, it's on equal par with that of what I learned at Indiana
Right.
University School of Music, the common practice era. That's 1600 all the way to the 1900s. The same thing about Black music. So many genres, and it's a very important music that again remains as an indigenous music of the United States. There, speaking of students, there is a question. One of my former students, who's now studying at graduate student here at UCLA in the music college, I believe, and he asked the question: how has the pandemic affected the progress of equity, inclusion, and diversity for BIPOC in academia? And he goes on to say here, hypothetically, do you think anti-racist action would be different if we weren't or were not in this global safety crisis?
Okay, let me see if you might have to repeat the question.
Yeah, because you know, when he's thinking pandemic here, you know, there are two kinds of pandemics. There's the COVID-19 pandemic, and there is what we continue to see, and hopefully not anymore that much anymore. We got to stop it, and that is the shooting of Black and brown bodies. So that's a pandemic too. So I'm looking more at that pandemic, how it has affected the progress of equity, inclusion, and diversity for BIPOC in the academy. Or do you think anti-racist actions would be different if we weren't in this global pandemic safety crisis? So essentially, what has that Black Lives Matter coupled with COVID has done to push forward these anti-racist actions and inclusive equity and diversity for BIPOCs in the academy?
I will say this, and because I'm kind of 1 foot in the academy and 1 foot out, I will say that I think this moment that we've been in with this pandemic, I think on the one hand, it seems to have caused people to pay attention to the violence against Black bodies. And I think in that sense, it has created a moment where people are saying, okay, what's going on? Like, what are we going to do about this? I'm still, again, and so I think there are certain kinds of, they've been pushed. There've been things done to try and create more opportunities for BIPOC scholars. I've definitely seen a lot of that just across the board, whether they're jobs, whether they're fellowships. I've definitely seen a lot of that. In terms of what that means for the long term, I don't know. I know some of the opportunities that I've seen were maybe problematic in terms of what they were. I think also, I don't know how much of this is performative for the short term, right? And I think with just in general, with a lot of what's happening now, we're going to have to see what the situation is 2-3 years from now to really be able to kind of assess this moment in terms of the things that are trying to be done to aid or to assist or to make the academy less racist. I think we're going to have to see, but I've definitely seen, again, movement. I'll say that I've seen movement. That's for certain in the academy. I've seen it. So it's what that movement leads to is another story, but I've definitely seen that for sure.
Well, Dr. Brown, we would like to thank you for your knowledge, for keeping it real and keeping in the struggle of diversifying the music curriculum.
Oh,
and so we've kind of run out of time. Hate that. You know, I love these kinds of sessions, and it's just been so just invigorating. But I want to thank you on behalf of the School of Music and the Department of African American Studies. Warmly thank you for this illuminating way of looking at the inside and hopefully to make changes and continue to be progressive with the CPP. I love it. I love the CPP. Right. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you. Just thank everyone at UCLA for the invitation, for inviting me here, and for listening and for the conversation and the questions and the attentiveness. So thank you. Appreciate it.
So welcome. And before we leave, I just want to announce another one of our events, which will be the Still Waiting, How We Got There, Where to Go Next, Examining Assimilationism, in American Music Studies, which would be by Professor Philip Poole on February 25th, 3 to 4:30. So please join us again. And I wish to thank you on behalf of Dean Strimple and colleagues and students at the School of Music, Herb Alpert School of Music, and the Department of African American Studies. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Have a blessed day and stay safe.